Plenty of time to do her thing. So Jennifer McInday is an award-winning author, military caregiver for her brother, retired Army Specialist James Smith, and the proud mother of a United States Marine. She's a graduate of the University of Indiana and spent over 20 years working in marketing and public relations. Jennifer is the co-author of Friends for Life, Strangers Brought Together by the War in Iraq, which received an Eric Hofer Award for Legacy Nonfiction. Jennifer is a member of the Wounded Warrior Project team, an Elizabeth Dole Foundation Fellow, an active member of the American Legion Auxiliary, the VFW Auxiliary, and the Daughters of the American Revolution. A proud recipient of the President's Volunteer Service Award for her work with Soldiers Angels, the Herald Times recognized Jennifer as an everyday hero. She has also been honored with the Girls Inc. Strong, Smart, and Bold Award. So I'm going to do a little bit more intro for her because I think she deserves it. So there's no instruction manual to teach someone how to care for a family member who comes home from a war with significant injuries. Every injury is different and every family is unique. For Jennifer McInday, the injured warrior was her brother James. He returned home from Iraq with a severe traumatic brain injury, and Jennifer had to leave her job to care for him full time. Thankfully, she had the determination to seek out the support of other caregivers and organizations to teach her how to succeed in this important life-defining role. Since her brother's injury in 2005, Jennifer has been able to make her brother make significant progress in his recovery and has become a national advocate for other caregivers. So like I said earlier, for the past decade, she's been working with Wounded Warrior Project and the Elizabeth Dole Foundation to ensure others have the same support and guidance she once had. One of the ways she advocates is by sharing her powerful journey with audiences around the country to raise awareness for the challenges faced by our own nation's wounded warriors and those who support and care for them. Please join me in welcoming the Wounded Warrior Project, Miss Jennifer McInday.
Wasn't that a sweet introduction? Oh my goodness. Well, as many of you here already know, none of us can do everything for everybody all the time. We have to find ways to do some things for some people some of the time. And I'm definitely one of those people that wants to do as many of the things as I can. Now, I have a younger brother named James. He's a lot younger than me. Does anybody here had a sibling that was born when you were in high school? It's really kind of strange, I have to tell you. But, you know, I did my best to get to know him as he was a little kid and to be a mentor to him as he was growing up. But I knew the household that he was growing up in was a bit unstable because I had grown up in that household. So it wasn't really a surprise to me when he was in middle school and I was in my 20s that I was visited by Child Protective Services and asked if I might be willing to take my brother in and become his guardian. Things with our parents have fallen apart, and if I wasn't able to take him, he was going to be placed in foster care. Well, that was an easy decision for me. I welcomed my little brother with open arms, very naively. I know some of you here have raised teenage boys, or maybe you're raising them right now, or many of you were teenage boys once yourself, so you know that comes with a bit of a challenge, some hurdles, if you will. You have to remind them to do things like pick their dirty clothes up off the floor, or to put deodorant on, and to bring their homework home from school so they can actually do it. Just little things like that. But I did the best that I could, and I got my brother through high school. In fact, he made a magical transformation. He felt really inspired to work hard, not necessarily because of my parenting, but because he was on a championship football team. He actually followed in the footsteps of a young man by the name of Rex Grossman, who played at the high school in our small town in Indiana. And so my brother knew if he wanted to play football, he had to get his grades up. He had to stay out of trouble. He even had a part-time job at the movie theater. By the time that he entered his senior year of high school, we started doing what everybody does with their teenager. We started talking about what you're going to do to leave my house. Now, we both knew that the job at the movie theater was not going to be enough to get him into his own apartment and get him onto his own 2 feet. And college didn't really appeal to him. And so we started talking about another option, the military. And I remember I asked my brother to visit every branch, every recruiter, and then to take his time to make a decision. And so while he was 17, that's exactly what he did. And I sort of thought, well, he'll decide, by the time he's graduated, or maybe even a little bit after. But then, during the fall of his senior year, on September 11th, 2001, everything about our plan changed. My brother came home from school that day and walked into the kitchen after having watched the events of the terrorist attack on the news like many of us did here. And he looked at me and he said, "Jen, I've decided what I want to do. I want to join the Army. I want to go in the infantry because I want to fight the good fight for this country." Now, we didn't know that day who the good fight was even against. But I knew that my brother was convicted to serve our country. And maybe some of you who served felt that conviction as a young person yourself, or maybe you know someone who's been drawn to serve as a clergy member or in medicine. There was only one thing that stood between my brother and joining the military. He was ready to go right away. He talked to his guidance counselors, found out he had enough credits to graduate early, but because he was only 17, he needed the signature of his legal guardian on his enlistment papers. And so I went with him to the recruiter's office, and we both signed those papers. Before I knew it, my brother was off to Fort Benning, Georgia, where after a certain number of weeks and a lot of hard work and probably blood, sweat, and tears on his part, he became an infantryman. And the proudest day of my life up until that point was seeing my brother graduate from the Army. It was also a difficult day because by that time our country was at war in Afghanistan, and there was talk about war with someone called Iraq. I had no idea what that was all about, but I knew that soldiers and the infantry would be called to war. When he called to tell me that he was deploying to Iraq, he said he would be in Mosul, and I had no idea where that was. I remember I even got a globe out, and I looked at it, and I asked Jeeves. Does anybody here remember Ask Jeeves? But I wasn't spelling Mosul right, so I still really didn't understand where he was going. But he promised when he got there that he would call me. Only, teenage boys, they say they're going to call, and then they never do. But he had a good reason for not calling home. There were only a few phones at the base where he was stationed, and there were lots of guys that had wives and kids, and so my brother sent me an email and said, "Dear Jen, I'm never going to call you." And he told me why, and also he said the phones were actually kind of in a dangerous part of the base, and I now know that every part of that base was pretty dangerous. But he wanted me to do something. He wanted me to sign up for Yahoo Instant Messenger. He said we could stay in touch that way. Now, I hadn't used anything like instant messaging, or I sent a few texts at that point in my life, but I still had to push like the 1 several times and then 5. And so I signed up for it, and I'll never forget the first message that I got from my brother. And that signature ding on my computer. And there were words being typed from the other side of the planet. And in those few moments that we had together, we didn't even have webcams. All we had were those words. And in those few moments, I knew that my brother was safe. And he knew that somebody back home loved and cared about him. But as soon as the conversation ended, feelings of worry and fear just filled me. I moved my computer into my bedroom so that I could hear it ding night or day, and it was usually night because there's a 12-hour time difference. And I asked my boss if I could start working a little bit from home, maybe a couple days a week, so that I could have the news on and see what was going on the other side of the planet. Now, this was before we all spent our days working from home, and it was a bit of a stretch, but my boss agreed that would be okay. And I really became addicted to trying to find information about what was going on. whether it was from the news or from chat rooms with other family members from my brother's brigade, or just waiting for messages from my brother himself. His unit took a lot of casualties while he was in Iraq. He was in an Army Stryker Combat Brigade, which is kind of like a giant school bus with guns and armor, and it's meant for urban warfare. And every day it seemed I was seeing these strikers on the news, or I was getting an email from the family readiness group in the Army letting us know that there had been a casualty in the unit. By the time his unit left Iraq after a years-long deployment, they had lost 44 men in combat, and 181 men had earned Purple Hearts. It's an incredible number of casualties, equal to that of a unit during Vietnam. And that's why I spent a year on pins and needles. But around Christmas, I realized that my son, who was 8 at the time, wasn't going to have a very good holiday if I didn't get myself out of the house, get some presents, get a turkey. And so at the urging of an online friend whose son was serving with my brother, I pulled myself together and went to town. And I did all the things that moms do during the holidays. I had hot chocolate and listened to the music at the mall. But when I got home, I found out something terrible had happened on the other side of the planet. A suicide bomber had walked into a mess hall and detonated himself. But it wasn't just any mess hall. It's where my brother got his 3 squares every day. That was on December 21st of 2004. And it was 3 long days until all the families in my brother's unit were notified. You see, they had been inside the mess hall. My brother's unit had been on a mission and come in to get lunch. And just like we do in school, or maybe you do here at BOMA, they got their trays and then they sat with sort of the same people that they always sat with in the same part of the room. And as they sat down to eat, my brother's friend, John Castro, said, "Hey, Smitty." That's what they called my brother in the Army, Smitty. So if you ever meet him, you're allowed to call him that. He said, "Hey, Smitty, they're running out of cake." Now, if you have raised a teenage boy, or you were a teenage boy, you know that there's one thing they're never going to say no to, and that is dessert. And if they can, they'll eat it before their meal so they have plenty of room. And my brother was no different. So he said, "Oh, John, grab me a piece." And then he did something, well, I'm never going to be able to explain, at least not while I'm on this earth. He got up from the table and he walked to the door where the hand washing station was located. Now, I had never seen my brother wash his hands without a reminder in my whole life. And I don't know exactly who reminded him that day, although I have a pretty good idea. But washing his hands saved his life because the suicide bomber was standing right next to their table. And unfortunately, my brother's friend John Castro was one of the 14 men that died in the mess hall that day. My brother was wounded, but he survived the attack and in fact went on a mission even later that day, although he was wounded, to help find the perpetrators of the attack. Over the course of the next few weeks, I remember feeling a bit numb and even convinced that my brother probably was not going to come home. This attack hit us really hard in the gut. And many of the other families felt the same way, so we really kind of distanced ourselves even from one another. And I told my boss I'm going to go back to work after the holidays. And I was driving to work on January 25th of 2005 when my cell phone rang. That big fat cell phone just had the numbers, no letters. And I pulled over to the side of the road because back in those days, we did not answer our phones while we drove. And I answered it, and I remember I had this new feature called Caller ID. And it had a number with a plus sign and a bunch of extra digits. And I almost didn't answer it because I thought maybe it was a telemarketer. And when I answered, I heard a young man ask if I was the sister of Specialist James Smith. And then I heard my little brother's voice. And all he said was, "Hey, Jen, I got hit." While they were on a mission that day, my brother's squad exited the vehicle that he was driving, the Stryker, and his sergeant turned to him and said, "Smitty, I want you to go to the end of the alley and turn around and be right back here in 30 seconds. And if you knew anything about my brother, you know that he was planning to be back in 29. But what he wasn't planning on was what was hidden in the gutter of that Mosul side street. An improvised explosive device that detonated under his vehicle that day thankfully didn't kill any soldiers or civilians and only wounded my brother and the gunner who was sitting in the hatch at the time. It left a 200-foot crater in the earth. If you can imagine, it was a field at the end of an alley, and it left a giant crater through the striker, completely knocked my brother out, and left him with disabilities from those wounds that he still has today. He suffered a traumatic brain injury, damage to his spine. He lost hearing and vision. He's since had 20 surgeries to repair the internal damage to his body, including removal of some parts of his organs and other crazy things that have happened to him. He cracked all of his teeth, and I didn't know anything about taking care of anybody that had those kinds of medical conditions. But I knew one thing, and that was I was going to take care of my brother no matter what. So when he got to the Army Medical Center, I quit my job and I joined him there so that I could learn everything there was about taking care of somebody with neurological impairments, a cognitive defect, who had vision and hearing loss. And the Army was really good to us. They took very, very good care of us. And in fact, in the Army Medical Center is where we met Wounded Warrior Project. If you've ever seen any of our commercials on TV, you may have seen us giving backpacks to the wounded. And that's where we first met them. It was quite some time before I realized the impact on my life in my 30s, in my early 30s, of what quitting my job really meant. Now, all of you are professionals here, so you understand I no longer paid into my 401k. I was no longer earning Social Security credits. I was no longer bringing home a paycheck that I earned. I did thankfully receive a stipend from the government for helping care for my brother, but I didn't have my own health care, and I didn't have the networking that we all need in our lives, that we've all been missing this last year and a half. You know, I didn't have people around me to interact with. And when we left the Army Medical Center to transition back home and go into VA care and begin trying to rebuild our lives, I remember feeling awfully alone and thinking that I had to do everything for everybody all the time. And I was really good at being a caregiver. My brother will tell you, sometimes a little bit bossy, but I'm really good at being a caregiver, and nobody else could be as good a caregiver as me, obviously. So I didn't need to accept any help that was being offered to me, and I certainly wasn't going to ask for it. And the only problem with that is that you end up having more on your plate than you can ever possibly chew. And that went on for a number of years, and I began sort of feeling, off myself. I started having chest pains. And I started feeling, just angry and upset all the time. I had trouble sleeping. I was drinking a lot, like every day. After we finished all my chores and all my routines and got my brother settled, I might have a bottle of wine. So I went to the doctor, and I told her what was going on, and she diagnosed me with high blood pressure, which was true. I had high blood pressure. She gave me some medication, and she told me to join the gym. That might help relieve some stress. And those are two very good pieces of care and advice. But they didn't quite go far enough. She didn't talk to me about counseling, about taking care of myself, about taking time for myself. So I did what I was told. I joined a gym and tried to do the best I could to get my body under control. And the only bad part about going to the gym is that I had to leave my brother by himself. I didn't really have a lot of help coming in. And remember, I hadn't asked anybody to help me, and I didn't accept it when it was offered to me. So I would just, leave my brother on the couch with the remote control, go to the gym, come home. My brother has something called a vestibular impairment. Now, if anybody here owns a boat, you know what it's like when you get too much water in one of your ballasts. You can tip over. And that's exactly what happened to my brother. He might be standing right here in front of you and then just all of a sudden fall over. And he was kind of a big guy, so falling is bad for any of us, and falling when you have a brain injury can be very, very dangerous. My brother had fallen several times after he was wounded, and he broke his ankle. Another time he hit his head and had a big cut. So one day, when I was at the gym, I set it all up. You don't have to do anything, I'll be back in an hour. But he got up to get himself a cup of coffee. And when he did, he walked into the kitchen, got dizzy, fell over. So he called me. I'm answering at the gym. I get off the treadmill. I think I broke my arm. I'm lying on the kitchen floor. Thankfully, he had his iPhone in his pocket. And I said, stay right there. I'm going to call 911, and I'll meet you at the hospital. I'll meet the ambulance at the hospital. And I rushed to the hospital, and I got there, and I was so surprised to see my brother sitting outside on a bench. He had his arm wrapped to his body, stabilized, but after I started talking to him, I realized he hadn't had an x-ray, he hadn't even been inside, he had had no pain medication, he just had been assisted by the EMTs. And then I began piecing it all together. Because of my brother's brain injury, he doesn't always understand everything, and he doesn't always communicate things to other people in a way that they can understand. And so he told the EMTs that I was going to take him to the VA hospital. And so they left him there so that I could pick him up and take him to the VA. And quite honestly, I get how that can happen, and I get how busy medical professionals can make a wrong decision like that. My brother appears pretty normal most of the time and sounds pretty normal most of the time, and if you didn't want treatment in a hospital, they'd probably listen to you too. So I loaded him into my car, and I remember I was really struggling because he had a broken arm. It was very, very clear that he was hurt. And a nighttime security guard who was there came over and helped me load him in my car. And she looked at me and she started crying, and she said, your brother doesn't deserve this. And I assumed that she saw his Army hat and the Purple Heart combat wounded license plates on our car, and she put two and two together. And I looked right at that very nice, well-meaning lady, and I said, you know what? I don't deserve this either. That's where I was mentally. And we started driving towards the VA hospital, and I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles were turning white. And I remember thinking, well, can it get any worse? What are we even going to do about this? I can't believe my brother has broken his arm. And just about that time, it started freezing rain. Sleet started hitting my windshield, and my wipers were going back and forth, but they weren't really clearing anything off, and the ice was blurring the lights of the oncoming cars into one great big long line, just like the great big long line of the last 9 years of my life. And I remember I was thinking, what if we wreck, on this icy road? And then I started thinking, what if we wrecked on this icy road? I imagine there'll be a newspaper article, and the headline will say, Purple Heart recipient dies on icy road. I'll be done with this misery. My brother will be in pain. It'll all be over for both of us. Now, a few weeks before that night when my brother fell, we had attended an event with Wounded Warrior Project, and I have to be honest with you, I didn't really want to go. We met them, as I told you, several years before in the Army hospital, and they were always coming by and inviting my brother to go to things. Hey, Smitty, we're going to a ball game. Hey, Smitty, we're going to have a barbecue. We got some guys who are going to take us fishing. And my brother would always say, oh, nah, that's for the people who lost their legs. He never saw himself as wounded as the soldiers in the beds next to him. But when they called our house to invite us to an air show, of all things, in Chicago, I wasn't home. And my teenage son answered the phone at the time, and he began hearing them talk about meeting NFL players and going out to eat and meeting the Blue Angels, and he thought that sounded like a pretty good idea. And I, of course, have no control over teenage boys, and so my son said, we'll be there. And traveling as a caregiver of anybody, whether they're a wounded veteran or an elderly person or a child with special needs, it's tough You have to take all the equipment and the medication, and sometimes you have to take needles and a way to dispose of the needles. My brother has a service dog, so we had to take all the stuff the service dog needs. And we went, and it wasn't terrible. The best I could do at that moment was not terrible. Has anybody here ever felt that way? Like, okay, the best you're gonna get out of me right now is this, okay? But before we left that air show, I agreed to join a Facebook group with all the other people who were there because they said they were going to share pictures. And I thought, well, that will be nice. It'll be nice to see the pictures from this thing. But I had noticed in the nights leading up to that icy road that people were doing more than sharing pictures. They were sharing resources, asking each other for advice and help, asking each other for prayer and support. And I can't explain exactly why I did it that night, but before we left the hospital to head to the VA in our car, I went in that Facebook group and I wrote a message that another veteran read and recognized as a cry for help. And as we made our way down that dark, icy road about to make a fateful decision, my phone rang. Only this time it wasn't somebody with bad news, it was somebody that wanted to help. And just like our logo, that veteran, all he said when I answered the phone was, I want you to tell me where you two are because I'm coming to help. And when we got to the VA parking lot, here he was. And he scooped us both up and took us inside. My brother needed 4 hours of emergency surgery to repair a shattered elbow, and I needed emergency mental health intervention that I want everyone in this room to know is available at any emergency room, night or day. But because he was a wounded warrior who'd been through our peer mentor program and had transitioned himself and knew the path to our recovery wasn't going to come easy, he made a phone call that night to Wounded Warrior Project. And he said, we've got a family in Indiana that's in crisis. Is there anything you guys can do to help? And they immediately set into action. They talked to the hospital staff, made sure I was stable, which I was. I desperately needed help, and they were so kind. And they made some arrangements to send me away. Now, they didn't send me to a padded room, and I didn't have to wear a straitjacket, but I was feeling compliant by that point, so I might have done that. They actually sent me to Colorado to spend a week with 19 other women at a retreat, and those were the mothers of service members wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan, truly the only people on this earth that know what it's like to be me. And while we were there, we learned about something called caregiver burnout, and we learned about self-care. I'd never heard any of those terms. I'd certainly never applied any tactics to help myself cope with them. But we learned about relaxation breathing, some of the things that you learned about in your last meeting. We learned about making a care plan for ourselves in addition to making one for our warrior. And we got counseling, and then we also got counseled about the programs that are available to help our warriors. There were programs at the VA I didn't know about. There were programs at Wounded Warrior Project, like the Independence Program, to help our family so that I didn't have to do it all alone. Because let's face it, there was no way I was going to be able to do that for the rest of my life. None of us has the sustainability to be caregiving, to give care, and to be a caregiver without support. It's just how it is. Now, I learned about a couple other things while we were there, and that the Independence Program was going to start coming to our home 5 days a week to help my brother. I mean, that's transformative, going from having no one in our home to somebody there 5 days a week. And now my brother is actually able to live in his own apartment, and he makes choices every day about what he wants to do. He has someone accompany him to medical appointments or the many types of physical therapy that he has. But more importantly is that he's able to guide his own life and make his own decisions, and he doesn't have to live with his bossy big sister anymore. And I suddenly found myself with lots of time on my hands. And Wounded Warrior Project came to me and said, what can we do to help you? And I could have very easily said, oh no, that's for guys that lost their legs, but I didn't, because I learned the importance of asking for help. And so I said, what I really need is a job. I haven't worked in so long. I needed education. And they helped me get back on my feet. I hadn't used PowerPoint since I was using Yahoo Instant Messenger, so I needed a Skillsoft training. And they helped me rewrite my resume and use caregiving as an actual job experience, because it is an actual job experience. So I no longer had that giant gap on my resume. They helped me find volunteer work as a fellow with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and then eventually I started back in employment. And after about 2 years working with another organization, Wounded Warrior Project said, "Hey, would you like to come and work for us?" And I said, "Maybe. What kind of work do you have?" And they said, "Well, you're going to stand up in front of people that you never met before, and you're going to tell them about some of the worst times of your life." And for some reason, I said yes. So here we are, and I'm very happy to tell you that our family became much stronger, much more stable, and much more capable. And that was really important, because when my son was 17, he came to me, and in not so many words, he said, "Mom, I want to fight the good fight." And I said, "Grant, you have to wait till you're 18. I cannot sign anybody else's enlistment papers." And I'm proud to tell you that he did, and went on to serve in the United States Marine Corps. And though he was hurt too, we knew we could get through it, and we did, thanks to the support from Wounded Warrior Project. Now, I will not win Mother of the Year if I spend all this time talking and I don't show you some pictures of my boys. So I hope you'll indulge me. And I know when you look at these pictures, you'll see two brave American men who would fight and die for anybody in this room, anybody in this country. But I also hope you see a little bit of what I see. Was taken at a tattoo parlor, because what kind of military mom would I be if I didn't go to the tattoo parlor with my boys? I actually went to make sure it was clean and safe, which it was. I did not get any ink, but it was a fun outing. You know, phone calls have brought me the